Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Dr. Vincent Kiechlin. He is a chiropractic neurologist. I've interviewed him before. I keep having him back. The subject of what he does is totally fascinating, but more than that, makes a huge difference. I also happen to be his patient, and he has produced sometimes miraculous results, so I'm happy to have him here.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. So you and I always have these conversations anyway because you're so passionate about what you do, and you're always kind of in discovery mode and willing to learn more and explore more. And there's so much to learn, but a lot of people don't know what a chiropractic neurologist is. So maybe we can start with that.
Well, I'm a chiropractor, so I use chiropractic techniques to help people. But basically what a chiropractic neurologist does is we'll use neurological findings to determine whether what we did was helpful for the patient or not. So, so that is a big difference that I think that I like to use. That's really what distinguishes us.
And, you know, neurological findings, I immediately go to, oh, do I have to undergo these tests, EKGs or whatever?
No, these are simple things such as balance.
Okay.
Balance when you move your body in space, balance when you move your eyes in space. It really depends on the person and what they have while they're coming to me.
So by examining all of that and you just looking at the way they even stand and walk and move,
correct,
it provides you with a lot of information.
Correct. You should be able to see something before you treat them, and then you should see that change after if I did my job.
Yeah. So what kinds of patients do you work with?
Well, people with neurological problems, and mostly people who have tried traditional therapies and haven't been successful. So these are the people that I attract. So I will see a lot of people with balance problems, a lot of people with vertigo, people with memory difficulties, eye tracking issues, concussions is a big part of my practice. People with problems with their autonomic nervous system, so that's the automatic portion of your nervous system, from your pupil constriction, which is automatic, to whether I can hold urine in my bladder, those types of things. So blood pressure is all part of that system, which can cause all kinds of problems in people.
Wow. So do you have any particular kind of cases that you can talk about, or specific?
I mean, well, a large part of my practice right now is people with traumatic brain injuries.
Okay.
And these people have a multitude of symptoms, a lot of what I just talked about. They'll come in with dizziness, headaches is the most common problem that they exhibit. They'll have problems converging or diverging their eyes. So many times they'll complain of reading difficulties, or they'll get pain syndromes with reading, or sometimes blurry vision or double vision, and you know, they've been to eye specialists and you know, they get checked out and their eyes are okay. So you know, it's more of a neurological thing.
And you don't have to do a brain scan to?
No, you would do a neurological exam. Sometimes, I mean, if it's necessary, but most of the people have been to a lot of other doctors that I see, so they've had a lot of those tests done already. So a lot of times I review them, and you know, if there isn't a pathology there or something, then it's more my realm.
Right. So in terms of, you know, traumatic brain injury, right now there's a lot of buzz about that.
There is. You know, it's a really big deal in our country right now. To give you a for instance, about 50,000 people a year die from traumatic brain injuries a year.
Really?
There's about 3 million people on disability or who are disabled from them every year. And there was a recent study that just showed that, I believe it was just published like in JAMA recently, where they said that people with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common after a traumatic brain injury, die at a younger age than they normally would. So it's a huge problem. And you know, there's still a lot unknown about the injuries, although so much more is being learned really just last year alone. For instance, there are several papers published last year that showed the autonomic nervous system is affected with traumatic brain injuries. They know that these people have a reduction in blood flow to their head. So they not only have an injury, but they're not getting that oxygen and sugar that the brain needs in order to function and heal itself. So, and there's certain tests you can do just to see that. But that's a big problem. Some people have orthostatic problems where they'll feel dizzy, or they get rapid heart rate, such as Pott's disease and those types of things. And so you can get a variety of symptoms when you bang your head. And you don't even have to bang your head to get a traumatic brain injury. A lot of times just that acceleration, deceleration types of injuries that you see in sports or motor vehicle accidents or falls, all of those without even hitting the head can cause trauma to the brain.
Wow. So, you know, it occurs to me, like, where do you even start? Because all of these injuries are different.
They're all very different, extremely different. And, you know, they usually occur in young people. Mostly, you know, the people I see are usually athletes, you know, people in their teens or 20s. Some people have had previous concussions, and, you know, they're starting to get the symptoms now, and they're not really sure why. You know, these are very bizarre symptoms, especially if they're there chronically. So they end up seeking out somebody like me to help them.
So let's talk about that. So let's say you've had no symptoms. Is it possible to have no symptoms for a long period of time and then suddenly they show up?
It can actually, that is correct. Sometimes people will have months, a delay of symptoms for months, sometimes 5-6 months before they develop symptoms from them. And there's certain areas of the brain that are always damaged when you have a concussion. So there are certain tests you can do. So if somebody comes into me and says, can you tell me if I had a concussion? There are tests that I can do in my office to say yes or no, which is super helpful.
Yeah. And then, so you have all these million, whatever, 3 million or 2.2 million or whatever it is.
That are disabled every year.
Disabled. Is that reversible? Now, I know you can't make a blanket statement.
I can't make a blanket statement.
But can you work with certain people?
Sure, that is the goal, is to try to, you know, these people, they're coming to me complaining that I've lost function. I have difficulty driving. I can't look at computer screens anymore, and I need to for my job. Or I can't drive anymore. I can't play sports anymore. I don't think properly. I have problems remembering. All of these things are functional problems. And the brain's very good at repairing functional problems, but it always works better if you guide that change. And that's really what we do.
So it's fixable in some cases?
Yes, in most cases.
Wow.
You know, it depends, and how far you can take them. You know, really, everybody's different. I should say really that. Everybody's different.
So I'm going to ask you probably a bizarre question, but there are certain medications that can cause brain reaction, yes?
There are.
Neurological reactions or neurological
damage? Sure, there are many medications. I don't know about damage, but they have side effects to them for sure, to the nervous system.
So if you've taken some of the, because I met someone who said that this is what had happened to them.
Harvard did a study a couple years back where they showed that certain medications that you test, this was done on, I believe, benzodiazepines, and they found if you take them over a long period of time, I believe it was 6 months or more, then they can see cognitive decline for sure in these people. And they attributed it to taking these types of medications.
Is that reversible, do you think?
You know, it's not my field. I really, you know, I would love to.
Yeah. Well, why not? You do everything else. So let's get back to, you know, traumatic brain injury. So you have these kids who are athletes, and there are certain sports that put them more in the position of being injured, having brain injury.
Certain sports
football
are much
being
more,
one of them.
Yes.
What about soccer?
Soccer is a big one for the ladies more than the men, believe it or not. I believe soccer is number 2 for incident. Women's soccer is number 2 for concussion.
Do we know why that is?
I believe because women's necks are a little bit thinner If you look at some of the studies on motor vehicle accidents and whiplash, usually women are much more prone to injury than men just because their heads are still heavy and still large, and yet their necks are thinner. And so therefore, your neck is involved tremendously in all of these types of injuries. And most people, the damage is to both. It's not always just the brain, it's what feeds the brain. And a lot of that is your neck, your inner ear, and that guides our eye movements. So women's soccer is a big one. And then of course football, hockey, the high acceleration, deceleration sports are the biggest.
So why do we keep playing those sports?
They're fun.
So,
and they're doing a lot to make them safer. I mean, it's a huge push, because who wants, they are fun to play these sports, but more needs to be done.
Would you let your kid play football?
My kids don't play those types of sports.
Right.
My two daughters did play. My one daughter did play, and my other daughter still plays field hockey, which is a pretty dangerous sport, I think. But because the ball is very solid, I believe it has concrete in the middle, so it always makes me nervous when they're out there. But my son is a rower, so he's not involved in contact sports. But I don't think I'd hold my kids back if they wanted to play.
So what would you tell them, or what would you demand?
The biggest thing, I think the biggest thing is that if you want your child to play a contact sport, they should really, and the schools are all doing this now, is they should be screened before they play the sport. And there's certain, like the impact test is a type of test where they do certain cognitive tests, eye movements, balance tests, things of that nature. And then if there is an injury, they can do it right there on the field and know if there was a problem or not. And you can get treatment, because early intervention is always the best for these injuries.
And they are doing this in schools? This testing ahead of time?
It's a big thing. Most schools, I believe, now do them. At least for the contact sports.
So what happens if you do have an injury and then you want to play again?
There's a protocol that they have to allow kids to return.
Right.
And typically, you can't return if you start to play that sport and you start to become symptomatic.
Right.
So that is the biggest one. And then you have to go through a series of those tests that they did prior to you starting that sport. That's why that prior test is, that baseline, so to speak, is so important, because you have to at least be at that level before you return to sports.
Right. Right.
That's the best way to know if they're.
So let's talk a little bit about PTSD. You said that this type of, if I remember correctly, this type of brain injury can.
It does result in PTSD. That's been shown for sure. So it's when you have an impact to the head, lots of areas of the brain are affected by that, and the part of the brain that, unfortunately, these people who suffer from that doesn't work as well is also affected by traumatic brain injuries. So they can develop that over time. And that study that was just published in JAMA shows that the longer I shouldn't say that all PTSD people die younger. The longer they found, I believe, that that you had PTSD, the more likely you were to die an early death. I believe that was their conclusions.
So looking at PTSD in general, it covers a lot of territory. You can have PTSD from many issues.
So emotional traumas, doesn't have to be physical, it can be emotional traumas, can also cause that. Absolutely, I've seen that.
So I'm assuming that some is more treatable than others.
It really depends on the person, and frankly, in all treatment, a lot of times it depends on their health before they are injured. That's so much, whether you're going to be successful with that person after they're injured.
That's really a significant thing.
It makes a huge difference in whether you're going to help. That's why when people call me, I often they'll want to speak to me first because they're not sure I can help them, and so I often try to accommodate them on that. And a lot of times I can't tell them till they're in front of me, when I see what's going on and what's wrong, and can I help them.
So another case for let's stay healthy.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and we're going to jump back to this again, but what are some simple things that any of us can do, not to fix anything necessarily, but for brain health?
Number one thing I would recommend is walking. Short walks frequently. That is my number one thing that I give almost all my patients. Is people don't walk enough. We're very sedentary.
And what does the walking do?
Walking on two limbs is one of the few motor activities that only people do, and we do it by age 2. So it requires a large area of our brain to walk. So, and when you walk, you're also stimulating the automatic nervous system because it has to provide blood, and walking itself is something hopefully we don't think about anymore, and we just walk. So that's why we can walk and have a conversation, because if you had to think about right leg, left leg, right hand, you wouldn't do it. But that's what we do when we're babies. Between 1 and 2, we think about every step, right? You take a step and you hit the table and you look, see, hey, mommy, did you see that kind of a thing? So, so walking is the number one thing that I recommend for people.
So there's a lot going on when you walk.
There is so much going on. When you walk and you heel strike, your head moves in 3 planes in less than a second. It's very quick, so your eyes have to wobble in the other direction, and that uses all kinds of areas of your frontal lobe and your brainstem and your cerebellum to coordinate. It's a miracle. Walking is unbelievable. It really is. And the fact that we can do it and we do it so effortlessly is something you always want to keep. And if you think about it, when people's brains start to deteriorate, and you see it in their gait. Gait is an incredibly accurate way of diagnosing brain problems, almost as accurate as eye movements. So.
Wow. Do you have to walk fast? Should you get your heart rate up?
I often recommend to people to walk rhythmically.
Okay.
So you don't want to have something in your hand where you're not swinging both arms together. So you don't want to be on the phone when you're walking. You want to have your arms swing freely. I often have people will fixate on targets if they have gaze problems and problems with their vision, because the head just moves a little bit, but it's moving constantly when you walk, every time you strike your heel, so it exercises those systems, and it feels good, especially if you don't, if you keep it short. If you're not used to walking and you feel like, I want to get on an exercise program, but I'm not really sure what to do, I recommend starting off with that just to get your body, and then if you want to do other things more taxing, you can work your way up to those.
How many minutes?
I typically recommend 10 minutes.
Okay.
But frequent walks,
right?
5-10 minute walks a day is my mantra.
5 walks a day of 10 minutes.
5 walks a day of 10 minutes. So you add them all up, that's an hour of exercise a day.
But don't do them all at once.
I don't recommend that. I recommend that you break them up into smaller pieces, because you're less likely to fatigue, and you're moving more frequently. Your metabolism is up more. But the biggest thing is, if you don't know whether you're, and when I say fatigue, I don't necessarily mean, I felt tired from that. Fatigue could mean, gee, when I came back, my blood pressure was really high. Because your brain regulates your blood pressure. So, so if your blood pressure, it would go up a little bit because you exercised, but it should come down right away. If it doesn't, then, you fatigued out too much. It was too long. Okay.
Wow.
I recommend when you come back from a walk, you should feel refreshed, not tired.
Okay. So that's a good guideline.
That's a good guideline. If you walk in your house and you feel like, I think I want to sit down for a minute, it was probably too far.
I was going to say, I always want to sit down. Okay, so that's something, I love that. It's something practical that we can all do for brain health.
And there's a lot of current research that's starting to show that is a really good thing for your brain. I think I read a paper where they're recommending 4 times a day for 10 minutes. Had the best effect of all different types of walks that they did. So I thought 5 is pretty close.
Yeah. Okay, anything else that we can do just to prevent and keep our brains healthy?
I recommend people read and read on paper. Our brain reads differently on paper than it does a tablet. So you want to read, you want to write, and try to write in cursive.
Wow, but they're not even teaching cursive.
Schools are starting to again.
Okay.
So cursive uses a very newest parts of our brain. So, which is why you have to be a little older child to learn cursive. They teach you to print because it's easier, but as your brain develops, you should be able to do that continuously flowing motion with your hands. That's all fine motor. And so,
Wow.
So cursive handwriting is a very, very good thing in my opinion. And if you look at the brain research, you'll see it's the newest parts of the brain you use, the most human parts. And understand the human parts are the big regulators of all the primitive stuff. So the newest parts of our brain regulate our blood pressure. They regulate our heart rate. They regulate our emotions and our impulses. So they are responsible for delaying self-gratification. So, so those are very important things.
Yeah.
To have relationships with people.
Wow.
So they help give empathy for others. Those are all new things that, that most other vertebrates don't have those abilities. My dog
And
can
reading
feel
and
happy or
writing
sad,
contributes to that.
and reading or writing contributes to that. So those are two big things that, that I really recommend.
Why reading? I always read on paper. I don't read, I'll read an article online, but why is that?
It seems that they're not really sure for sure, but they do know it's different, that you'd use different parts of the brain, and probably because the screens are illuminated. It's a more visually stimulating experience than reading on paper, would be my guess.
Two other questions before we have to wind it down. Anything you can say about Tourette's?
Well, Tourette's is it's usually in children. It's usually found in children, and that's when it starts. It's for people who aren't sure what that is. It's a impulsivity type of disorder that's associated with behavior and movement. And typically these children, or it's mostly in children that it starts, have difficulties inhibiting motor activities, so they end up with tics, and sometimes they'll blurt out vocal tics, so they'll say words they don't have, or not words they don't have.
Words they're not supposed to say.
They're not supposed to say, or they don't mean to say, or sometimes it's just sounds that they'll make, and
so it's
there's
some
a lot
part of the brain that.
It's a very specific part of it's a very specific part of the brain that research is focusing on that seems to be the weakest part, but with Tourette's it can affect the whole brain. It's not just a weak area, but there's an area in the brain called the subthalamic nucleus that seems to be that, and what is its job is it's to help stimulate our brain to be quiet.
Oh.
So if it doesn't get enough of that stimulation, then the brain can escape that inhibition and you get a tic.
And is that fixable or manageable?
I've helped lots of children who have had it and been able to reduce or eliminate the tics completely, but they're all different.
Yeah.
So it depends on the child in front of me as to whether I can help them.
Wow. But look at, to me it just always blows me away that so much of what's going on, I mean, it makes sense, but we don't think of it in those terms, starts here in the brain. Everything, that's being managed, and there are things that we can do. So we have a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else you want to say about traumatic brain injury? Is there something you want people to know?
I would like to, one of the things I would just like to say is that, understand that if you've injured your brain, the brain's whole goal is to know where it is in space. That is the number one goal of the brain. So before the brain does anything, you wake up in the morning, the first thing your brain's doing is saying, I am here and I am in this room and I know where I am. If you ever went on vacation and you woke up and forgot you're on vacation, you get startled for a second if you forget that you're in a strange room until you realize you're in a hotel and whatever. So, and why is that the case? Because we have a brain to move. Beings that don't move do not have brains and nervous systems. So, and why is knowing where you are in space so important? Because you can't move if you don't know where you are versus the objects around you. So that is the first thing our brain will do. And when people do bang their heads, or as I said, you don't even have to hit your head to have a traumatic brain injury, then you lose that ability. Some of the systems that you use, so what do we use to find where we are in space? Well, we use receptors in the muscles, most of those in our spine, especially our neck, that resist gravity. And then we use vision and the inner ear, which feels gravity. So, And we're always spinning in the earth. The earth is always spinning under our feet, 300 miles an hour. So our brain has to accommodate for that so we don't even perceive it. That's how well it does. So, so that is a big thing that I think is very important that people understand with traumatic brain injuries. If you lose that one ability to know where you are in space, then everything downstream, which is pretty much everything your brain does, you could have some type of problem with. And so a lot of times, people don't have all of these problems. They have one problem that has many manifestations, if that makes sense.
Wow. And the most important thing is that it is not only potentially fixable, but manageable.
Oh, for sure.
And changeable.
It's changeable, for sure. It should be,
Yeah.
because understand, when I treat people, what I'm doing is that if they had an injury, the areas of the brain, the connections in the brain that they use to do those functions don't work anymore. So you can change their perception and change how those areas work by stimulating it to grow new connections. That's called neuroplasticity, the big
Wow.
buzzword. But
Wow.
that is the basis of neuroplasticity, is if you stimulate the brain without overstimulating it, it'll make new connections, it'll get stronger. And that's really what I try to provide for people.
And on that note, we have to complete.
Okay, sounds great.
So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming
having me.
back. Thank you for always teaching me something. And thank you for supporting the studio and my show. I totally appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm happy you were able to come.
Thank you.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.